So assets, securities, commodities, the rights and title to commodities, these all live in the law and these all live offline. So it's very hard to reconcile that natively into the ledger. That was the problem that we've been working to solve, is not just reconciling the ledger, but multi-party reconciliation of legal claims that also can give that, again, that machine readability, that machine verification that can speed up commerce and speed up trust in the system.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here.
Welcome back to our Smarter Markets Holiday Special 2025, the year in review. I'm Dave Greeley, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. We're continuing to revisit the conversations with our guests that helped us understand and articulate the themes that would come to define 2025. 2025 was the year in which we discovered that this was not the energy transition that we were expecting, the year in which a new geopolitical reality emerged and old geopolitical concerns resurfaced, and it was the year featuring a tale of two carbon markets and the need for new weather markets to manage the risks posed by reliance on renewable power. And finally, 2025 was the year in which there was both a new gold rush and a rush into tokenization. We hope you'll sit back, relax, and enjoy part 2 of our 2025 Year in Review. Josh Crum, founder and CEO, Abax Technologies. You launched Abax Exchange and Clearinghouse, introduced 9 listed futures contracts from LNG to environmental products in the carbon space to battery materials. And now you'll be listing a gold futures contract for delivery in Singapore. That'll be the 10th listed futures contract at the exchange. So now you're kind of back to where it all began again. And so I wanted to ask you, why gold now? Why in this way?
We always had on the list, or I had on the list, problems just going back the days working with you and Jeff Curry at Goldman. Some of the market structural problems that I saw, or we saw, was LNG, the nickel market, obviously the emerging markets like carbon and battery metals. What really gave me the idea that gold also had an opportunity was what happened during COVID and the pandemic, and the first time that the EFP, the difference between a 100-ounce bar in New York and a 400-ounce bar in London, that blowout immediately put gold on our list. There's something else to be done there. So again, it always starts with a problem rather than just going in and into a market that's already being relatively well served. If I just look at the order of priority, the one thing that gold, we weren't able to launch gold right at day one, even though it's on our list for a long time, was the spot market aspect. It was unlike our other futures markets because we're also launching a central limited order book on spot gold in a warehouse or in a vault. So that actually had more infrastructure to build than just the futures. Otherwise, we probably would have listed the gold future before. But ultimately, it's also, and I know you talked already a lot in the previous episodes about this, but it's really the gold is the first market that can really bring all of that together, right? Like a new spot market in vault, very much like we built at BitGold, many years ago, tied to a futures market that's a regulated clearinghouse. And then the third piece, as you know, is we also want to use gold from that spot market or in that vault as collateral in the clearinghouse, but collapse the settlement time and the clearing time much faster by using this digital signature technology. So the gold market, again, it's always been on the list. It's always been core to the vision. And now it kind of jumps from being our fourth market to our first fully integrated market of the future with spot, real-time digital collateral as futures all in the same place. So yeah, it's quite exciting that this will be the first sort of full stack innovation from the ground up, from technology to the way that the market functions.
We all know that right now gold is having a moment, it's capturing a lot of attention, and you're introducing this first full stack application into the market right now. How are you thinking about the current macro environment for gold?
The reason why gold works as a measurement tool, as a representation of money, is because it's so highly correlated with energy. At the end of the day, it's energy that's really the lifeblood of the economy. Well, energy and information. But energy itself is the much larger money stock. But, as we discussed at the beginning, energy can't be stored the same way. Going all the way back to Keynes and the bank core and everything else, right? Oh, if we could just take all commodities and make that money and not just gold, that'd be a better system. Well, ultimately, by using gold as a substitute for all commodities, because they all have the same energy basis, that's sort of what currency is. Currency really is just a representation of energy and economy across borders. So I always thought that gold was going to be a piece of the re-anchoring of these monetary systems post quantitative easing. But I actually don't think gold is the most important piece of that re-anchoring. I actually think it's all commodities and particularly energy. And that was another reason why we have liquefied natural gas at the core of the exchange, not just gold. I actually think LNG, I actually think it's already there. I think LNG is the global commodity of energy balancing around the world, very much like oil was for many decades. I think LNG is becoming the energy basis of the global economy. And the main reason is because oil is becoming a byproduct to the gas market in the US. Once oil becomes a byproduct, you don't have the same level of control as you had with OPEC and all of the other geopolitical events before. I do think that energy is the more important re-anchoring of the monetary system than gold, but gold will play a role and energy will be a key part of it as well.
Given how central the gold market has been to shaping your thinking on the role of market infrastructure and technology and making markets better, making them smarter, how are you thinking about the role of gold in our financial system in the future?
If you can get the collateral side right, if it can be hedged and moved as fast as you can move treasuries today, it will, in my view, it becomes a higher, better quality, high quality liquid asset as collateral. I think your first episode talked a lot about that. There's two aspects of being good collateral. One is the actual fundamental soundness of the asset, but the second is just the speed and liquidity of which you can utilize it. How fast can you trade it? How easily can you hedge it against other currencies? I think the fundamentals for gold versus sovereign bonds kind of speak for itself all throughout history. There's not a single sovereign bond over any real period of time that's outperformed gold as an asset. I think the quality of the asset has never been in question, but it's the liquidity and the ability to move it around the financial system. That's been the problem. So if we solve those two issues of liquidity and portability and fungibility, I think gold just becomes a superior asset, particularly in global trade. So look, I think it's already happening now at the kind of central, like abstracted to the central bank layer. Obviously, there's already been central banks rotating out of multi-currencies, US dollars, and into gold as just a central bank sort of core collateral. But I think even at the trade level, that will start happening sooner rather than later as well.
Steve Lowe, Strategic Advisor for Precious Metals, Abex, and former Managing Director, Co-Head of Global Base and Precious Metals at Scotiabank. When you look at all the money that's going into and then sometimes out of and into the gold market, more into than out of recently, and people, as you said, globally looking for an alternative safe haven to the US dollar, when you look at the infrastructure that's available in the gold market to handle those types of flows and that increasing use, how do you assess it and what do you think is needed?
I don't give it a very good mark. And to me, it's a real shame that I'll call it gold is having its day, so to speak, in terms of as an asset class. And maybe it's the beginning of a day that lasts for centuries. I don't know. But overall, the infrastructure and the way gold trades is still incredibly fragmented, incredibly opaque, and just incredibly difficult to do. And I think maybe we'll talk later about various technologies and various people that are trying to do certain things. The World Gold Council will call it as sort of the main driver of trying to build demand and ecosystem in the gold market. They acknowledge completely that if infrastructure and transparency and all these things were in the market, and if the infrastructure for people was there to allow them to trade, I mean, demand would be twice as much, right? I mean, people always find a way, so maybe not twice as much, but the gold market's really missed a trick in terms of evolving. Your gold trades exactly the same way it trades when I started to the market, which is a long time ago. Nothing really has progressed. And there's been lots of, we've got a gold token here, we've got this there, but overarchingly, nothing has really changed. I can tell you, because I looked at it recently, I want to invest in gold. It's so tricky in terms of how to do it, and it just shouldn't be, right? It should be a no-brainer. I should be able to go to anywhere trusted, and even here for me to buy like a DTF, it's just complicated, and it just shouldn't be. And it should be so straightforward, but it's not.
And why do you think it's not? What's standing in the way?
That's the old, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's a really good question in terms of why the drive, because you think, okay, there's enough demand. Why aren't people clamoring for an easier way to do it? And I just think they look and they just put their money elsewhere. Like, okay, I won't buy gold. I'll buy a gold mining stock. It's so much easier to do that. There are a lot of, from an institutional, big players who are just very sedentary and very happy in their business lines and don't feel a compelling need to change anything because they're making money. And the sort of the concept of changing everything to build a bigger pot, it almost goes against their human nature. I don't want to build a bigger pot. I got a pretty good share of this pot. So I can guess that I might build a bigger pot, but I might put some of my pot at risk. And I'm not sure I'm going to do that. And quite frankly, my pot's big enough. So I'm just going to do that. But that's at a very institutional level. And as I said, it's a fidgety business, right? It's an asset class that has different forms, different purities. There is an issue with traceability in terms of, okay, where did it come from? So it's not so straightforward in terms of dollars. Currency trades are easy, asset trades are easy. Gold's a bit messy.
I do want to ask you, when you think about the role that gold could play in our future, what do you think that role could be? And given our conversation about your career at Scotia, what do you think the next iconic gold business could be?
I think literally gold plays the role it should play. Okay. So people, my wife included, always says, why does gold have any value whatsoever? Like it's just a thing, right? It's just a scarce commodity. It's just a store of wealth. And I hate to say it just because it is, right? It's been a store of wealth and something that people have wanted and has really retained that wealth for thousands of years. So if you need a safe haven, if you really need somewhere to park your money, I can't believe there's any long-term better asset than gold. I mean, there's obviously over periods of time, yes, real estate's good. Gold is a great place to just do that. So in terms of, I don't think that role will change. Will it be a foundation for currency? We will go back to that. In my opinion, not a chance, right? It's just not going to. There's not enough. It's not intricate enough. But will it remain this slightly esoteric asset class that people invest in? Absolutely. The next great trade and what people are doing is to just build the system and the rails and the ability for people to do that properly. And, working with various companies to try to do that because it's such a no-brainer. If we can make gold really accessible to people in a trusted fashion, which is the real difficulty, right? If you have something that's not a physical bar, if it's backed by a physical bar or it's a promise that the physical bar is there, that's where a problem occurs. How do you build that trust? But it's possible. It's clearly possible. If you can design that and build that, and I don't know, and gold price will skyrocket for the first part because people have ready access to it in a super liquid market, and that's a global market. That's its role. And it's a great role. Not going to change.
Sunil Kashyap, Managing Director at FinMet Pte. Limited in Singapore. It's very interesting, right? Because in finance, the first thing you learn about is the risk-free asset that everything else anchors. And especially in the US, we're used to thinking of that as the US T-bill is the safe asset. But, in a world where there's more geopolitical upheaval, more uncertainty about the dollar, certainly, gold becomes much more interesting. And if you're not in the US, it's a more interesting, potentially risk-free asset. One of the things you said when we talked the last time that really stuck with me was how gold has much more of a role almost as a means of foreign exchange for people in Asia. And when you talk about gold from a more Western perspective, a lot of the conversation still floats around large banks and central banks as the main players. So I was curious, do you think the West has something to learn from Asia in terms of gold being used more at the personal level than, say, at the level of the big banks and central banks?
I think there's two aspects I would talk about. One is a subject in terms of why is gold different? You mentioned safe haven. The important reason why gold is a safe haven is that unlike almost every other asset group, gold is not a liability on somebody else's balance sheet. So I think what people in the West are beginning to realize, something that people in Asia knew all along, is that when you have issues with regard to the issuers of certain assets, whether it's equities, bonds, or foreign currency, when you have issues with the actual issuer of that asset, then you start getting worried. And the only asset which can provide that safe haven where there's no issuer involved is gold. In the past, when you thought about safe haven, like you said, you people say, okay, sell equities, buy bonds. But now what you find is, okay, who is the issuer of the bond? The US government. Who is the US government? Right? And that's becoming clearer to people every day that the US government is not, sort of widely held, managed entity. It's actually managed by a small group of people who can change government policy at a whim. Okay. That was something that's a huge surprise. People thought there are checks and balances that you can't change policies overnight, but it's happening. So that uncertainty about the actual issuer of the old safe haven T-bills is creating a problem. And that's why people are gravitating towards gold. And that's why you've seen gold prices go up so much and continue to go up. So every day when you listen to analysts in the West, right, they say, we like gold. Why? Because implicitly they're saying, we're not comfortable with T-bills like we used to be. So I think that's where sort of the West and East now are coming towards the same view.
And as they come to the same view, it's interesting. In the West, as you said, for decades, gold has really existed outside the mainstream financial system. In Asia, it's probably been somewhat in parallel, but much more part of the mainstream. What do you think we need to do in both the West and in Asia to integrate gold more into the mainstream of financial systems and people's asset portfolios?
Let's start with Asia. In Asia, the investors are brought up from a very young age knowing that gold is a valid asset group. Right? They see their families buying gold. Gold is exchanged during weddings, during New Year celebrations, during family events. So they see that physical gold being exchanged and say, oh, this is a store of value. This is something you need to invest in. So I think that's inbuilt there. I think in the West is driven largely by financial advisors and brokers, right? And the commissions they can earn on gold or trading of gold is so small because the gold market is so efficient that they typically don't recommend gold, right? They prefer bonds or equities where the spreads are better for them. And what you're finding now is that they are gravitating towards it because their customers are asking for it, right? And there's no other option. And so people are buying gold. What is missing in the West still is it's not easy to buy gold. I mean, the only real viable options are the ETFs, right? Physical gold still is not easy to buy unless you're awake late in the night and flipping your television and you see these advertisements for gold. And even there, the markup is like 15%, 20%, right? In Asia, the markup is less than 0.5%, actually 0.25%, right? So it's an efficient financial asset to buy, even in physical form. And it's not efficient in the West yet. So I think where we're going to see is a situation where if consumers in the West can buy and sell at very thin spreads over the physical price, there will be a greater adoption of the product in physical terms.
There have been a number of attempts over the years to build financial gold markets in Asia. And I'm curious, Sunil, from your experience, what worked, what hasn't, And what do we have to learn from these past efforts?
What hasn't worked is taking a contract from the West and try to transplant it into local markets, whether it's a futures contract or it's some kind of a physical contract. I think people in Asia want a closer relationship between the financial asset that's being traded and the physical underlying it. They want fungibility between the two, they want deliverability between the two. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's not worked out. Where it has worked is, like I mentioned, where you've created some kind of a digital wallet, which is trades 24 hours a day with very thin margins, is backed by physical, and allows somebody to trade in local currency at very small transaction sizes. So because Asian economies are smaller, the disposable income is lesser, people in Asia want to have a product which they can buy or sell in small lots with thin margins. And I think that's something that has been successful. There's a lot of people who offer digital wallets across the region, and they've been moderately successful, more so in countries like China, in Thailand, and in India. And there's been fledgling attempts in Indonesia, Malaysia also to the same product. So overall, the financialization of gold is taking place, but in a different way compared to the West.
Wade Brennan, CEO and co-founder, Kilo Capital. I wanted to talk with you about the role of gold in the 21st century because at your company, Kilo Capital, you work with companies that use gold as part of their business. And you use the tools of bullion banking to connect these users of gold to the wider market of banks, central banks, and investors. So I thought we could start there with a term that not everyone may be familiar with. And so I wanted to ask you, what is bullion banking and what role does it play in the gold market of the 21st century?
Sure. So bullion banking is really about facilitating the activities of the real world companies that manufacture or wholesale or process gold and products that contain gold. And really, these companies borrow the gold instead of buying the gold. And that allows them really to solve two big problems that they have. The first is they need to finance that asset. In some cases, it's the biggest asset they have in the whole company. And the other big thing that it does is it helps them be agnostic about really what happens to the price of gold. If you think about a jewelry manufacturer, the jewelry manufacturer, let's say, they needed 1,000 ounces of gold to make some rings. And they intend to sell these rings to Walmart when they're finished. And if that jeweler just went out and bought the 1,000 ounces of gold and then went about the business of turning that into rings, then when the day came to sell it to Walmart and Walmart said, great, what's the price of gold? And I'll buy those rings at the price of gold plus the per widget markup that we talked about, that jeweler is going to make or lose a lot of money, and it will have nothing to do with making of jewelry.
And I'm curious from your vantage point and from your seat, what do you see as some of the biggest problems or inefficiencies in today's gold market?
It strikes me as odd, and I think your guest, Sunil Kashyap, I think it was last week, he pointed out that with the spot price of metal being determined mostly by what the local London price is globally, that can cause some real friction. And he was describing, hey, we've got this situation where you got dealers trying to buy at the London price and sell at the New York price because, you can point at both of them and they're very widespread. And he saw, he pointed this situation out as happening in his market. And, I would say here it's very similar, right? I would say one of the bigger challenges is the whole world is using the same spot price, which doesn't tie to the futures market that most of the world uses or the local delivery markets. And so the fact that we have that two-track system with two different deliverable forms in different locations, well, historically, it wasn't a problem until COVID hit. It's become a much more acute issue over the last few years.
Another point that came up when we were talking with Sunil Kashyap last week, and that was when kind of talking about the attitude towards gold among private investors in Asia versus the West. And he raised the point that in many Asian countries and also developing economy countries, people are used to policy being unstable and their government being unstable. And so gold is seen as a stable asset, much more so than government debt. And in the West, we've had a very different experience of people think of a T-bill as the risk-free asset in the United States. And I'm curious, when you look at, it's very early innings, obviously, but do you see that conversation starting to change at all in the United States and among your customers? Or are you seeing more investors giving gold a look as a stable store of value?
I think the conversation has evolved here in America. The more recent uncertainty is definitely underscoring this issue and maybe making North Americans think about this in a way that we've been fortunate not to have to think about for a long time. We haven't had a good credit crisis in the West in a really long time. I don't think most people remember what it's like to take a bath on a bond. So, there's a lot going on there. I do think that situation is evolving, and I'm not necessarily a crypto enthusiast. I think what's been productive about that movement is the discussion of what is fiat currency, what is the reliability of some of these instruments, and something that the people in more developing nations have known for a very long time. It does seem like there's a growing awareness of gold as true money, really growing, here in America.
When you think about what you would like the role of gold to be in the 21st century, what improvements do you think we need to make to our gold markets, whether it's in market infrastructure or new technologies, to allow them to take on that greater role in the 21st century?
I think the biggest thing is we need a hedging market which is tied to the underlying local market price. And, again, I go back to what Sunil said, where, they don't know what the price of gold is in Asia when there's a disparity between London and New York. And why is New York pricing its spot on something in London? That's legacy. It's their grandfathers were there 300 years ago. Wonderful. That's probably time for some modernization, right? Having some spot market here in America that referenced the American spot price and tied to the derivatives market that we all use just seems like a sensible innovation that is long overdue.
Tom McMahon, co-founder, Abex Technologies.
Gold has changed over time, and as it has for me too. And I've been very fortunate enough in a number of the exchanges. Obviously, my experience on NYMEX and then COMEX, I was a director of NYMEX, late 80s and early 90s. And at that time, the fortunes of COMEX had dropped significantly. After gold's great run in the 80s, the markets for metals were significantly challenged on into the early 90s. And by that time, COMEX was looking for a savior. And it was NYMEX. And at that time, the fortunes of NYMEX had changed dramatically, because I can tell you in 1981, 82, NYMEX was almost bankrupt. It wasn't until 83 in the trading of oil that it changed its fortunes. And 10 years on, it was a much wealthier exchange than COMEX. And in 1994, it allowed for NYMEX to acquire COMEX. And that in and of itself was very interesting, because now you had oil and gold tied together. And so you had a bit of a seamless trade within the same building initially, when we still had floor trading activities, and electronification subsequently to that, as NYMEX was acquired by the CME and it migrated onto Globex, expanded significantly the role that gold played in terms of a tradable instrument within the commodities. So, and now that opportunity is for Asia. The vision that Asia has for gold is very different than North America, and different than Europe also too. It's culturally, it's much more ingrained, even down to the lowest nth. I mean, you can track like a country like Malaysia, 34 million citizens, and the average holding per year of purchases of gold is 32 grams of gold, every family.
And when thinking about the future, what do you see potentially as the role for gold and precious metals moving back to more of the mainstream of the financial system? And is that different between the more Western countries versus Asia?
I think gold is going to play a much bigger role. And actually, the reason why it's going to play a bigger role is because of the US dollar. Gold is a dollar hedge, and the Asians know that, and the Europeans know that. Actually, the Americans don't know that. And we're Americans, so we can say that. Yeah, it's very interesting. Try to explain, and there are a lot of gold nuts in America, some really great people that I've known over the years. It's very difficult to try to explain. Americans don't realize that their currency depreciates 2% every year within 10. That's built into the treasury, right? People like, no, I can still buy stuff with my dollars. That's okay. That's just domestic bliss, right? And unless you travel outside the United States or do business outside the United States, you don't really realize the impact that it has. Gold is that hedge, all right? I mean, for me, I've lived in Asia over 20 years now. I've owned gold the entire time, and I've probably negated all of my dollar losses just by owning that metal. Just slow creep, just balances out, balances out, balances out. Asia started to discover that if they want to de-dollarize, they need, it's not Singapore dollars swapping renminbi. It's Sing dollars owning gold and Chinese owning gold and using gold as that bridge, potentially as the hedge instrument, as opposed to just swapping renminbi dollars or renminbi Sing dollars. So gold is going to play more and more of a role. And also too, it plays that security role. People always go, in times of war and times of strife, people have always gone to physical things, right? I mean, diamonds and gold and stuff like that. And then people are like, oh my God, yeah, but you can't carry a ton of gold with you when the world goes to hell in a handbasket. Well, you don't have to anymore. You've got secure vaulting systems and you've got connectivity globally, right? Or in the case of Singapore has built a vault since 2012 efficiently, using LBMA good delivery standards, and allowed for private businesses and for single family and multifamily offices and for international banks to build a portfolio of metal within the country. The next step is the unlocking process of how you can use that as a hedgeable instrument, right? As a collateralizable instrument. It's going to be very interesting.
When you look out at the gold market and the greater role it could play in our financial system, the role it's increasingly playing in Asia, what do you see in terms of how the infrastructure of the gold market may need to change and evolve to be ready to play that greater role?
I think it's got to be generational. I think gold has been stuck in probably 3 generations in the last 100 years. And again, if you look at America up to 32, 33, it had one idea of what gold was, and then a gap of 40 years of no gold. And now the new metal, and it's still not a mature vision. Where European vision on metal is, it's very conservative, it's very commercial, and where Asia has got a very, very different working relationship with gold. It utilizes metal, as I said, industrially, commercially, as an investment for portfolios, as a currency hedge, as a security hedge. So they treat gold very, very differently across all the different cultures. So no hesitancy of ownership in Asia, still a bit of an education in North America. Europeans are still going to be very conservative and think that, interestingly, Europeans think they own the gold market. That's a fact. I think it's changing. It's really the Middle East and Asian markets that are going to dominate metal in the next decade. Really, the key is the generational shift. I think young people actually understand the value of something shiny as well as something that's digital. I can't get a 40-year-old to buy an ounce of gold, but I can get a 20-year-old to do it. If he can buy it with his ETH or Solana or with something like that, they'll say, yeah, I want to own some of that. Give me some of that. And I can trade it. So we're seeing liquidity build in that generational shift also. And I think that's going to scale in time.
Albert Chang, CEO, the Singapore Bullion Market Association.
If we want to grow from a regional hub, what is the next area of growth that we need to look into? So we say, let's compare with London. So we look at what we have and what London has, and we compare. And most of the function London has, we have, except 2 things. One is we don't have an inventory of gold like London. The sovereign state and institutional investor store their gold in London. The Bank of England have more than 8,000 tons of gold and plus other custodian service in London. there are close to 10,000 tons of gold in London. We don't have that. And secondly, we don't have a clearing system for gold, like the local London price. So if we can achieve these two things, or build out these two things into Singapore, we could actually become another supplementary global hub in Asia. Because we look at the last 20 years that physical gold consumed or being bought in Asia, in India and in China, plus Southeast Asia together, it accounts for at least 60 to 70% at some time of the total new gold production every year. But with the legacy and the settlement system, everything needs to be settled in London, which is fine when all traders are used to it and they have a formula to calculate the differences. But what if there is an Asia time zone hub in Singapore in Asia hour for all the players in Asia to clear the gold in the same day? And if they have excess gold, they do not need to send it back to London. They can send to Singapore. And if the two market is talk to each other, it can be swapped, it's fungible, and it's safe, and it reduces the carbon print.
There's this desire to integrate physical and digital gold markets. What do you see as the opportunity there, and what do you see as the challenges?
I think, of course, there is huge opportunity as the world is digitized in all aspects. And I think gold market is one of the least developed market in terms of digitization. I think the reason for that is our transaction need to have physical gold. And the physical gold, not every single piece of it is digitized. I mean, most of them, because of its transient usage, except the 400 ounce bar, which is stored in London deep cold storage, the kilobar is just in time use. When a jewelry manufacturer receives a kilobar, they melt it down into jewelry. An investor may keep it for a longer time, but once it go out of the chain of custody, it has to be melted down when they return to the system. So these are some inherent barrier of gold. So it also create a barrier for digitization. So I think the financial market is all moving in that direction, and the gold market cannot resist. So we need to follow that trend. At the moment, we are not equipped ourselves enough to follow the trend. I think it might have to start with digitization in all your gold in storage. At the moment, I mean, we all understand that in London, the Bank of England gold, they are all stored there for many years. And so they are all handwritten, I exaggerate, they are all handwritten recording of all the details. And it's not digitized. And it has issue if you have to digitize every single piece of gold in London. But if we are able to start from a clean slate, like what you said, it can be piece by piece beginning the journey of digitization of gold, and it can start from here.
Looking back over these past 40 years and all the efforts that have led to this moment, why do you believe that now is the right moment for Singapore to emerge as a leading global center for the trading of gold and other precious metals?
I think the external economic environment, the financial market jittery, and the uncertainty make it that it is actually the good time to look into a infrastructural improvement in Singapore in order that we can capture this opportunity. And also to give the industry a tools that it might actually help them to build out a more business opportunity in ASEAN country. And I mentioned Indonesia this year, and equally, and at the same time, Vietnam government also has abolished the monopoly of gold tail bar making in the country, which is a big deal because they used to monopolize it with one company and in order to control the market. And the government has come out and say, we like to abolish this and we like to gradually opening up the Vietnam market, which by itself is an important gold market in ASEAN. So I think Why now is if we are able to do something in terms of enhancing the infrastructure in Singapore for the gold industry, it will help the industry to slip forward into the next stage. Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, as I said, is the last frontier market, is waiting for people to come and to explore this opportunity. And a lot of people is thinking of, if I'm not there, I will miss out the opportunity. And hence you see a good turnout of the APPMC this year. We also have a lot of people asking for membership because they want to be connected and they don't want to miss the business opportunity.
Ian Forrester, Head of Product at Abex Technologies.
And I just don't know how a market can function as a truth-seeking mechanism when it is surveilled top to bottom and all of its participants' actions can be predicted before they happen. I don't see how that market can function as a tool for discovery. And I think that's where I think we're heading with all of this, or at least making a very honest effort to write that. I mean, the most important thing, and this is why we've spent a long time with the Verifier Plus app, the most important thing is ensuring a solid connection between the person and the act of signing. And we have this in the real world. The other thing is none of this is new. We're simply doing our best to model in the digital space what we already trust in the analog space. I have sort of an unofficial motto that I don't really share with people, but I'll tell you and our listeners, which is make the internet paper again. How do you take the secure and verifiable and provably scarce qualities of paper that have built so much of, and honestly, data preservation? I mean, papers have been a great medium for preserving data over the centuries. How do you take those qualities and move them into digital space such that we can preserve those tenets of analog real world deal making in and among the dark forest of the internet? That's the challenge. No small feat, but that's the challenge that I think us and everybody working in the space is really trying to tackle. So again, it goes back to, how do you tie back to that person? How do you take the action of signing, this thing that we do with our hands, and put it in a digital space? And I think 20 years ago, there wasn't really an answer for this. These days, though, we all have this incredibly secure, highly personalized cryptographic signing device in our pockets. For us, it's through the Verifier Plus app.
I'd love to talk about how we use these to do real important commercial transactions, ones where things are at stake. We've talked about digital identity, the ability to cryptographically sign a message, and want to see how that kind of all comes together. And I know you've talked about your approach in terms of the 4 pillars of a transaction. So maybe you could walk us through those pillars.
We sort of have broken it down on 4 axes, which we're calling the 4 pillars of a transaction. And this is for any transaction, right? Sort of scales, but certainly gets more important as the stakes get higher. And those 4 pillars are secure identity. You have to be secure in who you're dealing with, right? You can't have a transaction with one person and then midway they switch to a different person. That doesn't work, right? You need to have a consistent, secure identity throughout the transaction. The intent has to be secure and the data has to be secure. And I'm sort of bunching these together because they are related. So transactions are all about intent at the time of transaction. You have to make sure that what you intend to happen is what's actually happening, and what you're agreeing to is what you're actually agreeing to. And then your counterparty needs to make sure that whatever you've agreed to, and we've talked about this several times, you can't just say like, oh, well, I didn't say that, or I didn't sign that, or oh, my assistant signed that because they had my DocuSign login or something, right? Like, so that intent has to be secure both during the transaction and after. And this is, I think, one of the biggest pieces, because recharacterization and repudiation, if the system allows for those things, then it's not a useful system. Nobody can really rely on it, especially as the stakes get higher. So the tools that communicate that intent have to be secure. They can't be corrupted. And then this is where secure data comes into play. The record of that intent must be stored alongside the transaction and the transaction data. And that data must also be secure. And then obviously you have to have a secure asset. And that's where I think we can rely on, and certainly many firms who are approaching this are relying on existing infrastructure, BNY Mellon, the sort of network of asset custodians and warehouses that currently exist. You have to be able to work with those systems, with those stakeholders. So that's the four axes. And then how do we sort of bring that all together so that each of those pillars can be secured by the signature, so that that digital signature that we place so much on can function as the anchor, as the trust anchor for each of these four pillars. That's really how we're approaching this build out with our various tools and APIs and workflows.
Riley Hughes, co-founder and CEO at Trinsic.
Turns out there's a lot of hard problems, right? It's not for lack of trying, right? So there's a few things. I think in 2016, 17, 18 timeframe, the sort of introduction of Web3 into the zeitgeist introduced people to this idea of that you could possess like a non-fungible thing on a device or whatever, right? Or at least you could possess like cryptographic keys that could be used to sign something that a counterparty could just trust. And this concept of a verifiable credential really became popularized around this timeframe, where some trustworthy entity could sign verifiable credential and issue it to a wallet, and the user could use it. And if you look today at the digital ID landscape, most digital IDs are not anchored to a blockchain or based on blockchain. But I don't think they would be here in nearly the level that they are if that sort of Web3 wave hadn't come. So I think that's a big element of it, is it had to show the world that this is possible. And then once the world saw how this could be done, I think adoption has just been growing around the world ever since.
I think it's interesting too, because for people sitting in the US, people would say, well, I haven't used a digital ID, not that I really know of, or most people aren't that familiar. But as you said, in Europe and other countries, it's already much more integrated.
Yeah, and like in the US, if you have Clear, you've registered and been verified by Clear, and now the TSA is accepting Clear's attestation of you. So if you have Clear, you've used a digital ID. If you've logged into the IRS with your ID.me wallet, and then later logged in to claim some benefit or re-logged in next year to the IRS or whatever it is, like you've used a digital ID. If you have TSA PreCheck, you've used a digital ID. If you've been verified on LinkedIn and then used that LinkedIn blue check mark to then apply for a job where the hiring entity can see that trust that was established with LinkedIn, you've used a digital ID, right? So I guess it depends maybe on the definition here, but I think not all digital IDs look like a decentralized identity wallet, maybe is my distinction I'm making. Decentralized identity wallets will make that user experience much better and put consumers more in control of how they share their data and put privacy more at the forefront. But fundamentally, it's the same thing. It's an attestation given by some entity and then accepted by another one.
That's really interesting. It's all kind of being built below the surface, at least from the user perspective, it sounds. And you mentioned that one of the biggest challenges and part of why you founded Trinsic was this fragmentation. Is that the biggest challenge you see out there to more widespread adoption? Or is it that second part of getting the individual user comfortable?
I do think that that is the biggest challenge. I think fragmentation is the biggest challenge because consumers, if we've learned anything through the social media age and now the way that people are interacting with AIs and whatever, if there's a little bit of value to it, then consumers will trade a whole lot of what maybe they would have been uncomfortable uses or something in exchange for a little bit of value. And I think if you can improve your life, do things more easily, get access to more services more quickly and more seamlessly, consumers could just create a unique username and password with a unique password with every website they wanted to go to if they wanted ultimate privacy and security. But instead, everybody logs in with Google because it's just a little bit more convenient. So I think if digital IDs are accepted more places, then consumers will, over time, pick up on it and start to use them. The challenge with acceptance is there are 18 different digital or different mobile driver's license wallets in the United States, for example. And that's just the United States. That's for 24 different states that issue an MDL or something in 18 wallets. The fragmentation is really quite extreme, at least in the US, and if you look globally as well. And so that, I think, is really the biggest barrier to acceptance.
Carrie Jakewith, Global Head of Digital Product at Abex Technologies.
Adoptable comes up quite a lot. And there are a couple ways to think about this. There's the, does it fit into my human physical behavior patterns? Is it going to force me to adopt a multi-step change that is going to dramatically slow me down? That is a very common adoption problem, especially on Wall Street, where financial services never stop. The lights don't go off. So if you're bringing change into the environment, you really can't pull the car over on the side of the road and train people. It has to be trainable in flight. It has to be trainable and adoptable in flight. And if it has to be pulled alongside, it can't be so disruptive that the real day-to-day work can't stop. Some of this risk of disruption, remediation, can be remediated by bringing in extra help for a period of time. And you'll see that happen with different cycles of technology adoption where you'll see a net new team come onto your trading floor and sit alongside you while this migration is happening. Like, that's a very common paradigm. And then there are sometimes failures to adopt where you can really attempt to force the change and the humans resist it, and the team has to go back to the table and rethink their approach on how to deploy. I was thinking about a common learning that comes up when you're teaching students how to design products, data products that sit on very large data sets. Every student goes through a very similar path. Step number one, they dump all of the data into a workspace. And all of the data is visually overwhelming for the human. The human sees 10,000 rows of data, 10,000 columns of data, and the humans who are asked to adopt and test this first version of every student's project immediately shut down and do not adopt the product. They immediately shut down. They're just like, this is too much. What every single student who's building those platforms realizes is they have to first set up the data. They have to provide a way for that data to be explored and audited, but they have to create a second layer. And this second layer is the human interaction layer. This is the layer of interaction design where the humans are given the ability to see what action they should take and to question and audit if an action seems weird. So if a recommendation seems weird, they need a way to audit. And I think about this through the lens of adoption. So any technology that is that 10,000 column, 10,000 row presentation will flatly not be adopted. It is too hard. It is too slow. You have to do the hard work of abstracting away and securing the information that's too much for the human brain. And you need to give them the abstraction layer that is usable, trustable, usable.
And when you think about what's happened in recent years, do you think like a set of best practices has emerged when it comes to adopting new technologies?
I think that you have to approach seismic changes by building bridges to them. It's very hard in institutional finance to turn the switch of a process completely off so that you can turn the switch of the new process on. Rather, it's a much smoother transition for the humans and the machines to build in a way that is augmenting and is interoperable. That word interoperable is key. If you think about in the late aughts, early teens, when Microsoft was required to open its code base, the European Union required that Microsoft made Microsoft Office interoperable with open XML standards. And you may remember starting to see this little X at the end of your Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files. So instead of DOC for doc, it was docx. That change, that was a massive code base change. And one of the ways it was made possible was interoperability. You could open that file on either machine. You could open either type of file and it would feel fairly similar. It was not. Under the hood, the guts of the code was not similar. And what no one saw in the front of the house or in the user side of the house, no one saw the deep, deep work that was happening behind the scenes to transition from one code base, from a binary code base to an open XML code base. But it was made possible by the bridge of being able to open both types of files until that older type of file could be deprecated. That paradigm of helping industry maintain stability and operability by providing interoperability for periods of transition, that's such a powerful tool to bringing change into live work streams that really can't shut the lights off.
Leah Wald, Digital Title Lead, Abex Technologies.
Tokenization, as mentioned, as powerful as it is, does have a fundamental limitation. Most tokenized structures leave holders as unsecured creditors on the issuing platform. So the token is a representation of ownership recorded elsewhere. And in an insolvency scenario, that token provides no perfected claim to the underlying asset. At Abex, we call that the insolvency gap. And it's the core reason we believe institutional adoption has stalled to date, that plus maybe the reporting requirements. So digital title does just take a completely different approach, really looking at determinism as well as legal finality. So the digital title certificate isn't the representation of ownership. We say it is the legal instrument itself, and that's constituting the documented title under the MLETR standards. So if your record keeper fails, your ownership claim is directly with the custodian, and no intermediate insolvency can break that. And that's just a huge innovation. I would also say, and it's important to point out where Abex's ID++ protocol becomes essential differentiator too. So digital title works because it is built on the verified identity infrastructure. And tokens are bearer instruments. So whoever holds the private keys owns the asset. Lose the keys, lose the asset, no recourse, not good. Digital title certificates, though, are registered instruments, so bound to verified legal identities through ID++. Huge. So if credentials are compromised, identity can be reestablished through the standard corporate legal processes. So comfort when you go to bed. So that privacy identity layer is what makes the legal architecture really enforceable. So we're not wrapping assets in tokens. We're creating a new foundation of how ownership transfers. And that's one that tokenization is trying to solve. But through legal finality rather than digital representation is how we're going after it. And I'll just say that's where I think the elegance of digital title also is crucial to understand. It just needs to do one thing: establish who owns what with cryptographic proof and legal enforceability. Everything else, the speed, the programmability, the instant collateral mobilization, that flows from that foundation. But it's an elegant solution.
And I know internally at Abex, you've been collaborating quite a bit with the technology and the clearing teams as part of these pilots. I was wondering if you could walk us through a little bit, to the extent that it's appropriate, what actually happens step by step when a security like a money market fund is transferred using digital title? And how is that different from how a transfer works today?
That's a great question. I'll be sure to spill all the secret sauce too. No, so let's paint the picture of the current system first. And maybe you'll chime in with some fun stories as well of just how much doesn't work still in traditional finance. But I think most people don't realize how much is happening behind the scenes. So let's use an extreme example that we're trying to solve through. You get a margin call at 6 a.m., the bank opens at 9. Simple, happens all the time. And that's 3 hours when you're exposed with no solution. Once operations begin, transfer touches your custodian, maybe a tri-party agent, possibly a collateral mobility platform, then the clearinghouse. And each layer is taking a cut. So from our research, it's about 12 to 15 bips stacked when all is said and done just for that process. As we know, settlements T+1 at best. Let's not even talk about international wire transfers failing or taking multiple days, right? And then you have multiple databases to reconcile. And if anything is off, you're into fail resolution. So now you're in trouble even further. And meanwhile, and the big one is you're holding about 3 to 5% buffer capital just to survive these different timings. So consider that sit and wait and wishing, right? And trillions of dollars are just trapped in this process at any given moment. So it works, does, but it's expensive friction that everyone has just accepted as the cost of doing business. And we know that you shouldn't. And what excites me about digital title is how it rethinks the problem from those first principles. So rather than trying to make the existing pipes move faster, it asks, well, what if ownership itself could transfer with legal finality instantly without the underlying asset ever moving, right? And that's the core insight. So in the money market fund pilot, the assets stayed with the original holder's custodian. What transferred was the ownership itself, not a security interest requiring perfection, but direct ownership via the digital title certificate. Huge. And that transfer happened immediately with cryptographic proof and legal enforceability. So one authoritative record with an audit trail. And here's what I find really elegant of the flow is that the original holder in the pilot was able to continue earning yield on the asset even while it's serving as collateral. And we call that the living collateral. So same economic outcome as the traditional process, but without the intermediary stack, without the timing gaps, and without the trapped capital. So again, I think it just takes back to those learning lessons where we're not trying to ask anyone to rip out their existing infrastructure. It's designed to work with standard documentation, existing custody relationships. It's really integration, not replacement, but with a way better system.
Walt Lucan, President and CEO at the FIA.
So if we can get this right, then you can start to move money faster. You can de-risk the system faster, getting to T0, getting money in the right account faster. So those are all things that we have been working on, but we didn't have the ability because of the public payment rails to achieve those. And we had to do workarounds as a result of this. But this fundamentally changes the game. So if you can move value any time of the day to de-risk the system, we can start to think more broadly and also start to grow the industry. The ability to do that, if there's less risk in the system, it means that there's more capacity in the system to take on new trading. For us, it's not just a helping to make sure the markets are safe and sound. That's incredibly important, but it also provides greater capacity for the industry to grow. And this is a great news story for us.
And this summer, you released an FIA white paper titled Accelerating the Velocity of Collateral, the Potential for Tokenization in Cleared Derivatives Markets. And I wanted to ask you, why is improving the movement of collateral so important? And what are the major benefits of tokenization for the movement of collateral?
Our clearing system is based on the fundamental premise that clearinghouses manage the counterparty risk of all its market participants, but that requires us to back trades by collateral. And we've been doing that for many, many years. That actually was one of the lessons of the financial crisis is our markets worked when others didn't. And it was clearing that was at the central aspect of why our markets worked. So this is trying to improve that clearing system even more by allowing the de-risking real time of trades. So as trades happen, we can collect from customers quickly, submit that to clearinghouses, and that just takes risk out of the system as it is happening. What we saw in the financial crisis was risk building up. No one knew where it was. They couldn't see it until catastrophic results occurred. So clearing allows us to be very transparent, to move risk quickly. And by modernizing through tokenization, the back office systems, it's really going to help us to do this even more in real time.
And have you heard any arguments for the risks this could pose to clearing if it's not implemented well?
No, absolutely. And I don't want to overstate how close we are to implementing this. It still is a promise, not necessarily in practice. And part of it is the word stablecoin. How stable is it? And so there have been points of time in the past where dollar stablecoin was not worth a dollar. And so how do we ensure that when you need cash, and that's really what in a default situation, if you're converting stable coins into cash, or if the stable coin itself is the end cash unit, is it going to be stable? Is it going to be a dollar? And right now, dollars are the reserve currency of the world because they do retain value. They're the riskless collateral that the world utilizes. But will stable coins take their place? And I think the Genius Act was passed in the United States. It has to be implemented to ensure that indeed there is dollar for dollar reserves, that those reserves can be accessed quickly. There's accounting of those reserves by regulators. And so that is super important to get implemented. And once we have that in place, people start to utilize this more. There's going to be more reliance on this. So we don't actually see this as a wholesale change happening very quickly, but something that starts to get implemented transitionally over time as people get more comfortable with it.
And how big of a challenge is it in that trying to bring change to an industry with global participants, but with exchanges and clearinghouses that are locally regulated? It would seem like you might have a bit of an all or nothing, right? If one jurisdiction approves it, but others don't, it could make it difficult in a global environment. How do you think about that, maybe with your former acting chair of the CFTC hat on?
Even our paper, we try to go to first principles of how this should look and what types of regulations should be a part of this project. But I think international standard setting is important. So IOSCO can be helpful in ensuring that the principles of how tokenized assets should move forward. They can help to set those principles and how regulators approach it. But I do think right now, the markets are moving so fast. The CFTC has been very aggressive in providing guidance and encouraging the use of these tokenized assets. I think Europe and Asia have been a bit more cautious about it. But like anything in the world, competition drives change. And so other regulators that see one regulator moving forward, they can either move forward with them or decide not to, but that may come at a cost. And so I think regulators, this is certainly not a race to the bottom because I think this is a blank piece of paper. I think regulators are trying to figure out what is the smart regulation, the right regulation of these products, but allowing these tokens to, I think the US moving into this space is likely to cause Europeans and Asians to move faster into this space and to try to sort of keep pace with allowing these assets going forward.
Josh Crum, founder and CEO at Abex Technologies.
Stepping back at its simplest, I like to say in the early crypto markets, when the asset lives in the ledger reconciliation is what matters. When the asset lives in the law, it's the legal reconciliation that matters. So diving into that phrase again, what does that mean? So really the revolutionary technology of Nakamoto consensus, what we know as Bitcoin and the Bitcoin blockchain, was really the fundamental technology here of what some might call triple ledger entry accounting, right? Like, so we've always had this double entry accounting since the time of the Medici or whatever it is, the assets and liabilities. But what blockchain really did is by creating that incentive system and that proof of work token that lived in the ledger, it allowed an incentive mechanism for that ledger to be reconciled all over the place without a central counterparty. And then Ethereum and Solana and a number of these blockchains have taken it to the next level with proof of stake. But again, the asset itself and the consensus mechanism and incentives are an asset that lives in the ledger. So for 10, 15 years, we've been very focused on how fast and what's the finality of settling this ledger. But again, the problem is in securities, the asset lives in the law. It doesn't live in the ledger. So at best, what we've seen is these ledgers that are, again, multiple parties can reconcile them in real time, which is great. But they ultimately are just pointing offline to a legal system somewhere else. So assets, securities, commodities, the rights and title to commodities, these all live in the law and these all live offline. So it's very hard to reconcile that natively into the ledger. That was the problem that we've been working to solve, is not just reconciling the ledger, but multi-party reconciliation of legal claims that also can give that, again, that machine readability, that machine verification that can speed up commerce and speed up trust in the system.
Whether it's the futures contracts that you're launching through Abex Exchange or the products you're developing at Abex Technologies, you're always focused on meeting the commercial needs of the market. You're always very intentional in making that first. So I wanted to ask you, what's the commercial need for tokenization that you are trying to meet right now?
Absolutely. And look, this series that we go through, we'll probably get into the weeds sometimes of how the watch is made, but we like the old adage, people don't care how the watch is made, they just want to know the time. That said, I think it is important sometimes when you have new technology to understand a little bit the how and the why. But focusing on the why, we come down to the movement of collateral, particularly when you're talking about futures exchange and the collateral that's needed in this market. The global clear derivatives industry is sitting on somewhere in the order of magnitude of $1 trillion in assets as collateral, initial margin and the variation margins as markets move. But that collateral is still predominantly moved in very slow settlement systems. Sure, the trade can happen in fractions of a millisecond, but the actual clearing and the movement of collateral and the settlement still takes many days, particularly if we're talking about international commodity markets. So that's really the use case. And particularly if you're looking at our markets, which are really centered from a physical and supply and demand side, is really looking at Asia. And I'm using very rough numbers here, but say something like 70% of the world's commodity trade happens in Asia. But at the end of the day, the financing is still predominantly in the US and London. And why is that? That's where the dollars are. That's where the collateral is. And so if we can free that collateral to be as mobile and its center of gravity move closer to Asia, we think that just opens up more financial infrastructure, more flow of goods, more markets. So that's why institutions, and that's why Abex and our clients are really focused on the secure and real-time movement of collateral, particularly out in Asia.
Thanks again to all of our guests this year on Smarter Markets. And thank you to my colleagues who bring this podcast to you each week. Tara Hayes, Darren Turner, Michael Sokol, Carlos Flores, and Louise Keene. We hope you enjoyed our 2025 holiday special, The Year in Review. From all of us at Smarter Markets, we wish you a happy new year and all the best to your friends and family. We'll be back next week to kick off a new year on Smarter Markets. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abex Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abax.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abex. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abex Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.